let's discuss the best and the worst tests for leaky gut. And if you've been minding your gut health, you probably appreciate that leaky gut is, to some extent, an important item to assess. If there is leaky gut, if there is too much leakage of particles from the gut lumen, from the gut lining, through into the bloodstream, then this elicits an immune response and inflammation, which can manifest as a wide array of symptoms. And we've discussed this in detail on the podcast in the past, but this might include, but not limited to, cognitive impairments like mild cognitive impairment, also known as MCI, brain fog, anxiety, depression, insomnia, even environmental sensitivity. So this includes food, because remember, food is from the external environment passing through your body, or things like mold or sensitivity to pollens and grasses. It may also include skin eruptions of various sorts, joint pain, fatigue, and even alter conversion or metabolism or release of certain hormones. So then begs the question, well, if I have these symptoms and I think leaky gut might be implicated in them, how can I assess? And that's what I want to break down and cover with you today. We'll look at the 4 main ways of assessing leaky gut, which are zonulin, indirectly through stool assessments, through tight junction or leaky gut barrier proteins, and also through what's known as the Lactulose Manitol absorption test. As we wade into this discussion, it is important to define, well, how do we assign if a test is accurate or not? Because sadly, just because a lab offers a test and the test might look really official, it doesn't actually mean that due scientific investigation has been performed to tell us if this test is accurate or not. So one of the ways that we look at this is, will a test distinguish between people with symptoms or disease states versus healthy controls? Another way of looking at this would be, do the people with symptoms, when treated, do they see improvements in their symptoms that correlates with the lab marker also improving? And then third and finally, are there normal ranges? This is also important. We've discussed in the past a neurotransmitter testing company that pled guilty to falsifying lab ranges, meaning they made the lab ranges too narrow so as to have almost everyone come back positive. So this is crucially important. If you're not feeling well, before you expend time and resources on a test, we want to know, is this test accurate? Let's start with zonulin. Zonulin is a protein found in the lining of the gut, and that's what you're seeing in this visual here. It's essentially the little piece of glue, if you will, that prevents your intestinal cells or your enterocytes from having gaps in between them. And these gaps can allow a number of things to leak through. Food particles. So this in part accounts for why some people say, oh, I was feeling okay. I ate a food and now I've had bloating, pain, diarrhea, brain fog, or maybe the next day I noticed joint pain or a breakout of some sort. But beyond food, there's also microorganisms and toxins that are always kind of flowing through. But when the gut barrier is compromised, these things leak through and then the immune system reacts with inflammation. So this is what we're assessing with zonulin. It begs a question though, is this an accurate test? Does it meet our criteria for saying this test is something that's useful? Partially. Does zonulin distinguish those with disease states or symptoms from healthy control? And for the most part, yes. Now, I'm not trying to give you sort of a non-committal answer here, but look at this. This is our data table, and this is a little bit involved, but just to impress upon you the breadth of research that's been published here. The way we've organized this table is zonulin correlating with symptoms versus data showing that zonulin does not correlate with symptoms versus zonulin improves post-treatment. And look at all the studies. Versus zonulin does not improve post-treatment. So you've heard me say before or share this quote from Darwin: ignorance more often begets confidence than does knowledge. And it's because the more knowledge you have, you see, holy smokes, there may be a few hundred studies looking at zonulin. So it's hard to say, well, yes or no, but what we can say is the majority of data does show a correlation between zonulin being abnormal or high and various disease states, whether it be inflammatory bowel disease, celiac, irritable bowel syndrome, metabolic diseases of various types. So zonulin does seem to generally correlate with symptoms or conditions. And by the way, if this has been helpful, please comment and subscribe. This really does help us reach more people who are trying to improve their health, so it is quite deeply appreciated. The second question, does zonulin track with treatment? Partially. We've discussed in the past one of the best meta-analyses. And again, why a meta-analysis, especially in this case, is so important. Look at all the studies. It's very hard to sort of eyeball and say, well, it looks like there's a correlation. So Frontiers in Immunology, great journal, 2023, they analyzed 26 trials looking at probiotics as a treatment. And they found there was a correlation with zonulin improving after treatment with probiotics. However, here's the key detail. This was for zonulin assessed via the blood. It was not shown that zonulin assessed via stool correlated, leading me to conclude that stool zonulin testing, at least at current, does not seem to have clinical utility in terms of it's not going to tell you if you've been successfully treated. That's what the data trend suggests. And then the final point on zonulin, do we have consistency with the lab ranges? Remembering back to that neurotransmitter testing company that kind of cooked the books, if you will, and made the ranges so narrow that everyone looked positive. There is some inconsistency with the ranges. So as helpful as zonulin can be, the research community is still trying to sort out, well, what ranges best discriminate and distinguish those with symptoms and diseases versus healthy controls. But all that being said, blood zonulin does seem to be an accurate way to assess leaky gut and also to track treatment success over time. So that's marker one. That is the zonulin. Secondly, stool testing. What happens in some cases is a stool test that's looking for dysbiosis, infection, parasites, maybe fungal overgrowth, or maybe even markers of the immune system like calprotectin, lactoferrin, secretory IgA. These can be used to say, well, boy, look at all these imbalances. With these imbalances present, you probably have leaky gut. I think that's reasonable, but the logic breaks down when considering the inconsistency that these tests show. Now, we have talked many a time in the past about the split testing we've done in the clinic, and here's just one of many examples that show inconsistency with stool tests. This is a stool test from one of the people on our clinical team. And as you see here, there are high scores of dysbiosis and then some indication of inflammation. This same person performed the same test 1 week later, changing nothing. And here's what you see. No more inflammation, and dysbiosis has now improved quite a bit. So this is why I've said, and I continue to say, and other clinicians have also reported, that stool testing is inconsistent. So it's very hard to make definitive conclusions based upon stool testing for the most part. It's not an absolute rule, but I do think we should be careful with how strong of a conclusion we're deriving from the result of a stool test. So I would say that looking at infection, dysbiosis, etc., and concluding leaky gut is present is challenging to do and probably not advisable. Now, that all being said, I do think it's somewhat fair to say the more symptoms someone has, the more leaky gut is probably present. But I don't think we can look at the stool test results to accurately quantify dysbiosis, overgrowth, or inflammation. So the stool testing results as an indirect measure of leaky gut, I would be cautious with. Then we come to antibody testing. And the antibody testing can look for antibodies against some of these regulator proteins that help prevent leakage. Zonulin is one, but there's also occludin as another. So you can look for antibodies to these various tight junction proteins. Do they meet our criteria? Are they an accurate test? Well, firstly, does testing for leaky gut protein antibodies distinguish between those with symptoms or disease states versus healthy controls? The answer here is no. A 2022 study found no difference between those with symptoms and healthy controls. There are a few other studies that have found a correlation between symptoms and levels of these antibodies. However, I have some major concerns here, and they are that all of the research comes from the same one or two lab consultants who work for this company, and no one else, no independent researchers have verified the results. That's point one. The other point has to do with the normative ranges. And sadly, when you read these papers from this lab group, what you see is very convoluted and very sort of what I would call fitting the data to support their hypothesis. One of the things I learned a while back with a different test, it was called Day 2, and this test was purportedly able to look at someone's microbiome as a predictor of your glycemic or blood sugar response to foods. One of the mistakes I made in reading that paper was the paper was so confusing that it was really hard to actually tell if the researchers had a novel finding. But I assumed, well, they're using very complicated language. I probably just don't have the depth of understanding to be able to assess this. And I learned something, again, very valuable there, which is if there is a clear, clinically meaningful finding, that will be apparent. The greater the extent that the language of a research paper is convoluted and confusing, and the more sort of stat jargon they use, the more likely they are just trying to sort of spin the data to reinforce their hypothesis. So I have a high index of suspicion that there is quite a degree of bias with the lab company that does the antibody testing for zonulin, occludin, and like markers. There's also another problem with antibodies, which is cross-reactivity. Sometimes we're not actually getting the result of the antibody, but something else, a bacteria or a virus, causes an antibody reaction. So the actual leaky gut isn't present. It's what's known as a false positive. Additionally, antibodies can remain elevated for a long period of time. So even after someone clears the issue, there might be residual elevation of the antibody. So for all these reasons, I would not recommend zonulin or occludin antibody testing to assess leaky gut. There's just not enough research here, and it's too much of this sort of two researchers publishing a small number of studies. No one else has verified this. And also I have, a high suspicion that they are searching for data to support their hypothesis and their lab, and they're not really being transparent with the data. Perhaps additional research will prove me wrong, but as it currently stands, would not recommend that test. There is a different test that I do think you may want to consider. This is the Lactulose Manitol ratio test. In this test, the individual is given a solution to drink that contains both lactulose and mannitol. You should not absorb lactulose, you should absorb mannitol. And depending on what shows up in the urine, this can tell us if leaky gut is present or if there's a healthy gut. Coming to the question of, does the lactulose mannitol leaky gut test distinguish symptom or disease states from healthy controls? The answer is yes. A 2022 meta-analysis of 19 studies found there was a accurate ability to distinguish those with either celiac or inflammatory bowel disease from healthy controls, and this did correlate with disease activity. This test has also demonstrated that it will track with a successful treatment, looking at probiotics, glutamine, and the low FODMAP diet. So pretty impressive and pretty helpful. And then regarding, are there good data for what the normal ranges should be or not, there's inconsistency here. So as good as the lactulose mannitol test is, the ranges are still not highly identified. And I'll just quote a 2022 meta-analysis. While the lactulose mannitol test can provide good diagnostic accuracy and offer some insights into gut permeability, it is limited by the lack of standardization. So I would recommend, or at least considered, using the Lactulose Manitol test. It seems to be one of the best. However, there are still some limitations with this test. So then in recap, the tests that you should at least consider would be the Lactulose Manitol test or the serum or blood zonulin test. I would not advise stool zonulin. I would not advise the antibodies to leaky gut proteins, and I would not advise to infer from bacteria, parasites, and inflammation if leaky gut is present. And then the final point I wanted to close with is, as much of a gut focused provider as I am, it's important to remember that leaky gut testing doesn't quantify the root cause. So you're getting a read of an indirect measure, meaning if you're drinking too much, if you're too stressed, if you have active infection, if you have bacterial overgrowth, if you have celiac, those things will then cause leaky gut. So you're quantifying sort of a reactive intermediary, which can have a time and a place, but it's just important to note that leaky gut doesn't just happen. It happens secondary to something else. So the testing can be used, but I wouldn't say it's going to be the most impactful testing because it's not telling you what's driving the leaky gut. And this is why I, at one point, was using leaky gut testing when we were doing, and we're still doing stool testing, but with some of these stool tests, the zonulin stool is included. And so we would look at that as part of our analysis. Now we're no longer taking that data into account because of what we've discussed. It hasn't shown to track with treatment. That's the breakdown on leaky gut testing, the ones you should use, and also the ones that you may want to consider not using. Okay, well, I hope you will comment and let me know what you think. And per the usual, I hope this helps.